Here we've been exploring some conservation issues. Next month in June, we'll present the final lecture of this series, which will be a talk by Jennifer Dean about invasive species on the plateau. During the summer months, look for a mini series about diversity, and our regular series will begin again in September. Tonight, we look forward to a special event. RPA Executive Director Jim Bonesteel will lead a panel discussion about land conservation and stewardship. So now I'd like to invite Jim to introduce our panelists and to take it from here.
Thank you, Alice. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here with 5 of my colleagues. Renee Bouplon joins us. She's the Associate Director at the Agricultural Stewardship Association to our north. And she's going to talk about some ag land conservation. And she has some other exciting news too. In this fall, she will be taking over as the Executive Director of ASA. Troy Weldy is here. He is the President at the Columbia Land Conservancy to our south. And he's going to talk about forest carbon work in New York, I believe. And Tom Duffus is the Vice President and Northeast representative from the Conservation Fund. He is joining us from Maine, and he's going to talk about the Conservation Fund's large-scale conservation work in New York and elsewhere. Bill Schongar is the regional forester at DEC Region 4, and he manages all the DEC forest land in Rensselaer County, not just Rensselaer County, but in the region, but all of it in Rensselaer County. And he's going to talk about DEC's work doing that, stewarding the forests. And then I will speak a little bit about RPA's work with community forests. And one other thing I'd like to say before I turn it over to Renee is that RPA partners in one way or another with all of these folks who will be presenting tonight. So Renee, why don't you share your screen and
good evening, everyone. Let's see if I can pull this up. Let's see. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, good evening. I'm excited to join you all tonight, and thank you to RPA for hosting this workshop. So the Agricultural Stewardship Association, which we say ASA for short because it's a long name. For those who don't know, we're based in Greenwich in southern Washington County, and our mission is kind of threefold. We're protecting our community's working landscapes, we're trying to connect people to the land, and also ensure a vibrant future for agriculture in the region. So we kind of work at 3 different levels. We're obviously working with the farmers and landowners themselves. We're working with the land and the long-term stewardship of it. And we also work with communities and families. But in the interest of time, we're just going to focus more on our land protection efforts and not necessarily our outreach programming. So just a little bit of context. You know, we started in Washington County and we benefited because there was some pushback, and the Northway went on the other side of the river, which meant our area stayed fairly rural, and we still have a lot of great farmland here. We started back in 1990. It was all volunteer board for the first 13 years. And did 30 easements in that time frame, and I'll talk in a minute a little bit more about conservation easements in case you're not familiar with those. And then the state started having some funding available to actually purchase conservation easements on working farms, and we started participating and bloomed from there. So jumping ahead, now we've protected about 25,000 acres, 146 easements, both in Rensselaer and Washington counties. I would say maybe 43 or so of those easements are based in Rensselaer County. We started working there in like 2003 or so. We do have one community forest that we're hoping to get up and running this fall, and we're run by a volunteer board and 8 staff. So when I say kind of protecting working lands, you know, what does that really mean? What are we talking about? And it's basically, we're trying to protect it from incompatible development. You know, farmland is a finite resource, really good farmland with good soils that can grow food and fiber and provide for us. So we are, you know, sort of cognizant of what happens when more and more encroachment comes onto farmland, and whether that's, you know, a housing development, whether it's what we call more rural sprawl, where maybe it's a house plopped in a field, and what happens over time, it usually comes out of production. And the farm sort of gets encapsulated by a lot more development, and that makes it really challenging. They're already faced with a lot of regulations, and when things come like this, there could be nuisance cases, and a lot of the ag infrastructure that our farms rely on, whether it's tractor dealers, you know, Cargill, Farm Credit East, you know, the large animal vets, all those tend to go away when you don't have a big ag land base to deal with. A lot of farmers are not interested in purchasing land where there aren't other farmers, because they want that infrastructure and they want to make sure that going forward, it's still going to be a good place to farm. So what we do want to see certainly is the farm staying in active production and providing, you know, food and milk and stuff for us. And I think, you know, given this past year that we've all dealt with, and, you know, a year ago going into a grocery store and seeing a lot of empty shelves and a lot of empty meat cases, I think we can all appreciate. And I think a lot of people learned more about their local farmers and where to get local meat. And so it's really important, as a growing population worldwide, that we have food security, and certainly local food security as well. When I talk about working lands, I have to talk about people, right? So the working landscape means there's people actively involved on the land. So the farmers and landowners we work with, they live on the land. They earn a living from the land, which is very important. And they're making changes, making decisions every day on their land that's going to affect that property going forward. And they're also raising the next generation. They're stewarding that land. So there's a lot of considerations that we have to take into account when doing agricultural conservation work. The other thing we have to take into account is, you know, ag is always changing, and there's a great variety of agriculture, but a lot of ag does require infrastructure, and that's really important. And depending on the type of farm, whether it's sort of an intense seasonal farm, like some of the vegetables or berries or orchards, or if it's even dairy, a lot of it also requires having workers on site, especially if you're dealing with livestock. So farm labored housing, thinking about what is going to help make that farm viable too. So even allowing for things like we call sort of another rural enterprise or home occupations, things that don't affect ag viability, but allow the farmer or their spouse to bring in other income that's going to keep that farm afloat during the waves that is farming is really important. So these are things that we have to think about. And, you know, the scale of farming certainly changes, the diversity of farming. So all those things are also taken into account. So when we're thinking about conserving properties, you know, and we do some forest land protection too, but I'm just really talking about ag tonight. What are things that we're looking for? We're looking for, you know, quality of soils. Are there prime and statewide important soils on that? Meaning it's likely to be more sustainable long-term if you can have a diversity of ag. What we know as ag today is not what it looked like 100 years ago, and it won't be what is 100 years from now. So we have to keep that in mind. We're looking at productivity, what's either currently in production or what could potentially be in production in the future. We're looking at long-term viability. We don't necessarily want to focus on the last farm in an area. Again, going back to wanting to make sure there's the infrastructure and the larger ag base so farms can really prosper. We have to think about sound agricultural practices. We as ASA don't determine that. Usually we refer to the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. They have definitions for agricultural that change over time. So it's fluid as we look at ag and think about ag as that changes over time and consumers' preferences change. So do those. So, and also when it comes to the actual, what's considered a sound agricultural practice also changes over time. Other things that I would consider sort of secondary purposes or kind of co-benefits of doing ag land conservation work is certainly water and open space, wildlife habitat protection, and certainly, which is more and more in the news, is climate mitigation and resiliency. So I'm sure others will talk a little bit more about this, but thinking about all the carbon storage that soil is able to do and how helpful that is. And, a lot of times, I know in the news sometimes they blame the cows for methane gas, but overall, an acre of farmland and produces 66 times fewer greenhouse gas emissions than an acre of developed land. And sometimes that doesn't get brought up as much. So when I say agricultural conservation easement, you may also hear it as purchase of development rights or donation of development rights. And so just for anybody that's not familiar with conservation easements, it's when you think about your land, it's not just the land itself you own, but you own sort of a bundle of rights. So you might be able to do timber harvesting. You might be able to build a garage. You might be able to subdivide, maybe have a little gravel pit. Those are all rights that you have. And when you place a conservation easement on it, depending on the type of conservation easement, you're going to put restrictions or even extinguish some of those rights for the benefit of the conservation resources you're trying to protect. So in our case with farming, we're still going to allow ag structures and farm labor housing and stuff, but there may be certain areas that we don't permit it, or we try to concentrate the structures that might deal with retail or marketing or a little more intensive use.
2 minutes.
Thank you. So these are recorded at the county clerk, so people can always find them, and it comes up in title work as well. These are private property, so the landowners still own them. You know that because you still have to pay the property taxes. That's a good key measure. But you can sell them, you can bequeath them, you can lease the land, but everybody is going to be subject to those conservation easements. And that's the job of ASA, is we have to make sure those are being upheld over time. So the projects are funded. A lot of it is through the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. There's a line item in the Environmental Protection Fund that has money to actually purchase easements. Sometimes we use a federal program, and sometimes there might be some private funding available. There's also donated easements. Sometimes people maybe are not necessarily working farms, but maybe they lease to farmers and they're in a position to donate an easement. And there's certain tax benefits and considerations with that. And people have questions, we can talk about that later. Land stewardship. So the fund really begins after the project closes. So we can stop all of our projects today, but we still have those 146 easements that we have to, oversee. So we have dedicated funding to help to make sure that happens. We do annual site visits. We actually fly in planes, not drones, to see our properties as well. There's lots of communication with those landowners and special events and basically ways to cultivate the landowner. So it would help keep us in their mind and hopefully not lead to violations. We also do a lot of work to try to keep farmers on the land. It's great to protect farmland, but we need the farmers to farm it. And so just trying to help farmers with succession plans, finding properties, beginning new farmers as well. I'll skip that at the interest in time. So why do people sort of protect their land? It could be because they want to diversify and they're considering sort of what's happening with the climate and what they can do to sort of sustain their property. It's about creating that retirement nest egg and making sure you can pass it on to the next generation. It's taking the funds and putting it in irrigation to sort of reinvest in their operation. It's sort of protecting the past, but also looking towards the future and what could happen on the property and how it might be important to the community. It may be sort of setting yourself up for the next generation. This is the Richards family. They do Bunker Hill Creamery milk, if anybody's familiar with that milk. And, it's sort of the assurance knowing that you've protected your land. It's available for farming in the future and obviously for food production that we all rely on. So I will stop there. So I will, let's see, let me stop sharing.
Thanks, Renee.
There we go. Is that good?
Yep, and we will turn it over to Troy now.
There we go. Unmute myself. Start my timer. All right. Jim asked me to speak about forest carbon. So similar to Renee, I'm with the Columbia Land Conservancy, and we protect farms and forest. Renee focused in on the farms that they're protecting in Rensselaer and Washington County. I'm going to focus in on the forest work and how we do some forest conservation, but more specifically, some opportunities that are available if any of you are forest owners, some opportunities that may be available to you to actually begin to be part of the climate solution and utilizing your lands for climate. And then just with why forests do so much for the landscape, just as farms do a lot for the landscape and the economy, forests do similar in regards to the protection of clean water, providing jobs and timber and biodiversity. And really the one I'm going to focus in on are the climate issues and how forests can be utilized to help us address the climate crisis in that we are in. And how we're doing that is utilizing our forests to sequester carbon. So we hear a lot about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and how that carbon is leading to and increasing the rates in which our climate is warming. Our trees, like we bring oxygen in and emit carbon dioxide, the trees are the exact opposite. The trees are bringing carbon in and releasing oxygen, and they take that carbon and they store it as part of their woody biomass. So that's what we call carbon sequestration. When a tree pulls the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and slices that carbon dioxide molecule, stores the carbon and releases the oxygen. And this graph here just shows where are there opportunities within nature to increase that carbon sequestration. And this is here within the US, and predominantly it's within our forest where we have these opportunities to sequester more carbon, primarily through reforestation efforts, which can get more expensive, which is what the different color bars are showing as the price of carbon, the price to do that work relative to other areas, or what's called natural forest management. And this would be the process of how we manage our forest, including timber extraction processes to be able to maximize the amount of carbon that's stored on the forest land. There are, when you start talking about carbon and the carbon that's stored within those trees, there are markets that are available where landowners can actually then sell the carbon stored on those trees. And here is some of the those markets that are currently available. LTA, or Land Trust Alliance, is getting a forest carbon partnership off the ground, but it's something that takes 5,000 acres. They're primarily focused in on land trust land as part of that. The Nature Conservancy has a program called Working Woodlands, and you can see the acreage there. You can also meet these acreage thresholds through aggregation. AFF, or American Forest Foundation, is getting ready to move forward with a family forest program here in the Northeast. It's currently working in Pennsylvania, and we're actually looking to bring it to Columbia County, and I hope Rensselaer County as well later this summer or fall. And I say they're about 200 acres. There actually is not a minimum associated with this, but in order to make the economics work, we're probably talking about 200 acres for that. The one that I'm getting a little more excited about, the Sylvia Terra Natural Climate Exchange. And I won't be able to go into a lot of detail about it, but I'm happy to both field questions, but encourage you to Google it and look this up if you have. And again, I say, the economics of it work better if you're looking at about 100 acres. They actually can do and have done projects in the 30-acre range. And these are the Sylvia Terra project. They're 1-year contracts. So it's relatively low risk. And we're actively seeking people to sort of test this model and see how it works on behalf of the landowners. There are also, you know, through non-payment, you could develop your own forest management plan that has a goal of sequestering more carbon. And I'd love to see some of our tax programs change. Vermont actually has a decent tax program that looks at forest carbon. New York isn't there yet, but I'm hoping they're able to modify their program to more directly incorporate carbon. But with any of these carbon projects, there are all sorts of things the landowner has to consider. You're probably going to want an attorney with some of the legal agreements that come place, although the Sylvia Terra one looks fairly simple. I do have, so I have the fellow buncher there in the background specifically to talk about carbon and forestry, and they can happen simultaneously. It's not that if you are trying to sequester more carbon in your forest that you can't also do responsible timber management. You can do both, and in some cases you want to do both. So this is where you actually can blend potentially the resources, the opportunities that are available within your forest, and maybe diversify revenue streams from your forest through some of these carbon markets. The other thing I want to introduce, though, is as you know, us as Land Trust, Rensselaer Plateau Alliance, Columbia Land Conservancy, others, as we're talking to landowners, as we're partnering with consulting foresters, one of the things I'd like to see us do is do more to get good information to the landowner, to talk to them about in really simple terms, not necessarily, you know, relative stand density, but just giving them a color chart in regards to what's the quality of their forest. And if we're seeing any, you know, any areas of concern, helping them to figure out, well, what can I do in order to improve the quality of our forest? And there, you know, depending on the forest type may depend upon why we have certain concerns, maybe due to forest pest, maybe due to high deer populations, or just past management practices that were there. And through subsequent management practices, we can help that landowner bring that land back to a healthier state, and healthier forests are going to sequester more carbon as part of what they have on the ground. So a tool that is available to landowners, Columbia Land Conservancy is going to start using this with landowners that we reach out to. And it's a tool to assess the resilience, the health, the productivity of forest. And you can find this tool if you go to forestadaptation.org. And there on the bottom, I say just search for Forest Health Scorecard. And then if you're in Columbia County, certainly I have some staff that would be happy to meet with you and talk to you how to work through this particular forest health report card. It's relatively simple in that it's asking you just a series of easy questions. This one here underneath forest diversity and composition. And generally, if your forest is more diverse, it's going to be at less risk or more resilient. And the example to that would be if you have a forest that is all ash and the emerald ash borer is now going through that forest and just devastating all the trees that are there. And you're going to have high concern in regards to the longevity and resilience of that forest. Whereas if your forest had ash mixed in with hickory and oak and all sorts of other species, it's then going to be at lower risk to keep that forest as a forest. And I think we're going to hold questions then till the end. I can go in more details on either the Forest Health Scorecard or carbon projects and carbon in general related to that. So as your questions, stick them in the chat and we'll circle back to those questions afterwards. Thanks, Jim. Turn it over to Tom.
All right, I'll start sharing my screen. I'm going to do it this way. There we go. Hello, everybody. My name's Tom Duffus, and I'm with the Conservation Fund. I may be calling you from Maine, but I'm a native to upstate New York and spent about 15 plus years of my professional career living and working in the Adirondack region. So I'm very familiar, and I am responsible for our work in New York State. So let me tell you a little bit just briefly about the Conservation Fund. We are a national land trust, similar to the others that have gone before me. We are a land trust. We work in the real estate realm to try to affect conservation, permanent conservation. We're a little different. We don't focus on the land stewardship or creating the priorities of which lands to protect. we are driven by partners like Rensselaer Plateau Alliance and others to offer assistance with projects. We focus on the tools to get the job done and bringing those tools to our local partners, including the state of New York as well. We are very, very active. We've protected over 8.5 million acres with partners since our founding in 1985, and certainly very active in New York State with almost 500,000 acres conserved in New York. And that is everything from a 3-acre property to the largest is 275,000 acre conservation easement with the former International Paper Company lands in the Adirondacks. But we are an organization that is lean and mean, and we're working all over the country. We also provide loans to our land trust partners, but usually what we do is step in and buy land because we can operate and work at the speed of the real estate market, whereas the public funding appropriations process and the fundraising process typically will take a lot longer, and the real estate market won't wait for that. So I'm talking to you today about forests. So the Troy was a great setup for this, as well as Renee, and talked about a number of these different benefits of landscapes. But what we're talking about is forests at the landscape scale, very large areas of forest that's remaining. And we are very fortunate in New York to have ownerships at the scale of the forests in the Adirondacks, Tug Hill, and the Rensselaer Plateau. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute here. But what we're trying to address here is the loss of these forests in general, the loss of these large forest ownerships. Forests have 60% of the at-risk species of wildlife habitat, and large forests provide that connectivity between different types of habitats within a landscape that species need to survive. Troy talked about climate resilience. Bigger is better. The more trees, the more carbon that's sequestered. But one thing that's really important is that large forest ownerships tend to, in rural America, and I would say in New York State included, is it tends to define and stabilize the rural economy and the community character in our regions. And when land ownership changes, that becomes a very upsetting, destabilizing impact to an economy, but also to the people that live there. So let me go into this a little bit deeper. This is a map. These are maps of the state of Maine, which graphically shows what I'm talking about better than any other graphic I have. And this is a time sequence. It's old now, but it's what happened in the early 90s. All that red there is paper company land. And in the early 90s, the paper companies all over the country, including New York State, began to sell their timberlands. In fact, in New York State, it started happening in about 1988 with Sir James Goldsmith, who bought the Diamond Match Company and sold all the lands in the Adirondacks and in Vermont. And then you can see in 2005 in this sequence, more blue, those are timber investors that have scooped up these former paper company lands. Paper companies own their lands for generations, and also other types of mill-based owners. And we're going to talk about the Coe properties here in a second. Mill-based owners created that stability in these communities. And then all of a sudden you had these new landowners coming in who are not driven by trying to feed a mill. They're driven by a return on investment. And these are short-term owners, 7 to 12 years rather than 150 years. So their decisions are much more short-sighted. They also, because they're driven by this return for their investors, they typically will lop off lands. And so the ownerships become smaller and smaller. Now you can see in 2009 to the right, there's hardly any red left. In fact, now half of that red is gone and it's turned into a purple or a blue. So that's the problem we're trying to address. And here at the Conservation Fund, we typically, our role is to really focus on innovating and implementing unique and state-of-the-art tools to address this particular problem. We work on farmland and Civil War battlefields and wilderness areas and all sorts of other types of properties, landscapes around the country. But in terms of forests, we developed this tool called the Working Forest Fund, and it's a pool of capital. But essentially how it works is that we have capital that we can use temporarily to buy a forest. We then own and manage that forest under a sustainable management plan, and we keep the property servicing jobs in the area, mills and foresters and truckers and loggers and so forth. And then what we're doing is buying time to secure permanent conservation for that land. And that does take quite a while. And that can be in the form of a conservation easement, which has been very well described by Renee, on the working forest land, keeping the land private, but in working forests. And sometimes in this process, we also convey lands to, for instance, New York State's state forest land, which is a working forest as well. So some of it goes public. But the idea here is that we buy, manage, protect, then we sell it, and then we use our capital to revolve back out of the property and into another project, hopefully right nearby. So to date, we have done this over many hundreds of thousands of acres around the country. You can see the dots. There are a number of dots in New York State there. We're busy in all of the forested regions. There are a few more dots in the Pacific Northwest now that we have done some other projects there. It's a very active program. Of course, the favorite place, the best place to work is in New York State. But how do we do this? So if we are endeavoring to interject ourselves in this investor-driven real estate market on these very large, expensive properties as land trusts, it's very difficult to come up with the money. So we have created financing tools, I call it a capital stack, that enable us to step into 15, 20, 30, 50, $80 million pieces of property on a temporary basis. We have a revolving fund, a revolving pool of capital that we've raised from donors for many, many years. Sometimes we get loans from foundations at very low interest or no interest costs. We use some fancy government subsidized tax credit programs, new market tax credits, too complicated to explain here. This past year, actually the end of 2019, just before the pandemic, we issued a $150 million bond on Wall Street. It sold out in 3 days, and that added to our pool of capital. And we have now been deploying that. Some of that money is sitting in properties in New York State right now. We also have partners that we work with, like the Nature Conservancy or other land trusts that will bring money to the table to help us with this purchase that they will ultimately buy from us. And then there is obviously fundraising. And then we ultimately will sell the land and revolve all of this money back into another project. So that's financing, that's getting into the property, but then we want to get it conserved and we want to get out as a conservation fund because we don't own land permanently or easements permanently. We're a temporary owner. We're sort of the fix-it folks that get called in on the emergency. So the funding, the conservation dollars that go in the ground really essentially look like this. While we're owning the land and we pay property taxes, we're also servicing some of the debt service, like on those bonds, and we have land management costs. We do cut timber. We lease lands out to hunting clubs, and we also raise philanthropic dollars to help us carry the property until this permanent capital can come in, and that can come from a number of different sources: the federal funding programs through the Forest Legacy Program, through the Community Forest Program that Rensselaer Plateau Alliance has been very, very successful with. State of New York, the Environmental Protection Fund is a big source of this kind of capital, and also private money. And our partners will also be the ones that are responsible ultimately for the stewardship of those lands. So that's another piece of the conservation dollar that goes in there, that once we step out of the ownership, it's then the responsibility of our partner to care for that land. So let me talk through three quick examples. I want to highlight the third one mostly, but this just gives you a snapshot. This is up near Cranberry Lake in the Adirondacks, Northwest Adirondacks. We bought this 8,000 acre piece of property. We have just sold out of the middle of it a corridor. I'm sort of putting my hand on it, a corridor river to continue the corridor that we helped the state of New York buy back when we bought the Champion International Paper Company land surrounding it. We then are about to sell a conservation easement on either side of the river to complete that project. The next project, and there's the Cranberry Project right in the middle of this, we're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together. So we acquired these lands in red, which are part of this original ownership, the Newton Falls Paper Company ownership back in the day. We bought 33,000 acres of land here, are managing it now, and we're in the process of conveying conservation easements to the state of New York and a little bit of land over here to the State Forest Preserve, but mostly conservation easements. And when that is completed, we will then sell the rest of this land back into the market, but it has to stay as a working forest with public access on the tax rolls and as a private working forest, so it stays in production. But probably you're most interested in the Coe Timberlands. And this is a project that Jim has been working on with us for probably 15 years. This is the land in red is the Coe Timberlands. There's Albany. And we've been monitoring the status of this property for many, many years. And all of a sudden it came up for sale. We scooped it up. We bought 22,000 acres, 16 and a half of which is in New York. We are managing that forest and paying property taxes. There are hunting clubs that are using the land, but we are in the process of selling all of this land in the New York side to the state of New York, mostly for state reforestation areas, which is a wonderful land use. There's still property taxes being paid and it's open to the public, but also generates continued jobs in forest management and is a very stable ownership. And then adding on to state wildlife management area. We also are addressing these properties in Vermont and a little bit in Massachusetts that were conserved recently. So with that, I'm going to stop, Jim, and turn it over, I think, to Bill. I'll stop sharing.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Oh, are you muted, Bill? I think you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
There we go. How's that, Jim?
Yep.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Schongar. I'm the Regional Forester for DEC's Region 4. I'd like to apologize first off because I don't have any of the fancy slides or anything like that my predecessors did. So I'm going to just actually expand on pretty much what everyone said before me with a few more details, concentrating mainly on the Rensselaer Plateau, as that's a nice focus area for us and actually one of our the most active acquisition project we have in our Region 4 right now. Before I continue, I'd just like everyone to realize, as Renee spoke and she mentioned all the different funding sources and the EPF and all of those, and then Tom continued on with the Forest Legacy. When all of our organizations get identify these acquisition projects, unfortunately, we sometimes have to compete against each other because these funding sources are so limited. So it lends itself to the long time frame that usually is required, especially for excuse me, for DEC to take ownership of a property. The Rensselaer Plateau, as Tom mentioned previously, that was actually first identified as a priority project in the New York State Open Space Plan back in the 1990s. It was either I believe it was 1998 or perhaps even an earlier version, but I know in the 98 version of the Open Space Plan, the Rensselaer Plateau was identified as a priority project for conservation for DEC. Since 98, it competed against a lot of other projects before it actually started getting legs. And it started getting legs mainly because of the grassroots efforts of the RPA and some other organizations from that point in time. So in 2010, we actually expanded it and went to the federal government, the Federal Forest Service, for the Forest Legacy Program. And what that is just another funding source that concentrates predominantly on purchasing conservation easements from willing landowners and things of that nature. They also do allow some fee ownership if you ask nicely to the federal government. So in 2010, we were lucky enough, DEC was able to get the Rensselaer Plateau recognized as a forest legacy area, which was important because it did open up an additional funding source outside just state funding sources. So one key component that makes any of these acquisition programs successful for any of us is the willing individual landowners. Without those, we won't have any kind of success. And I think everyone here can agree to that. It's especially true for DEC. Those willing landowners are the beginning of it all. So they will reach out, and then unfortunately, working for DEC, as everyone's mentioned previously, it takes a long time for DEC to acquire a property. The process is arduous at best, and everyone here has experienced that as we're partners and could speak directly to it. So it's important that we have these partnerships with each other, so we can, as Tom mentioned, they can move at the speed of their markets. DEC can't. There's just too much out there that would slow us down. So back to the plateau. In 2015, we were reached out by a willing landowner and started negotiations with them. Ended up bringing in RPA. RPA ended up bringing in Tom's organization, the Conservation Fund. Together, we all worked together, and because of the willingness of the Gundrum family to work with everyone, we were able to protect over 1,100 acres, I believe it is, Jim, to this point. That started in 2015. DEC just took ownership of a portion of that property last month, I believe. And so that's a 6-year window. That'll give you an idea of how long the process takes. And we're not even completely there yet. It was very similar for the Coe lands, as Tom mentioned. The Coe lands became available, and then they swooped in and protected them, and then they're working with us. And just to give you an idea of how big of a project that is for us locally, the Coe lands will double the size of 2 state forests on the Taconic Ridge. It will double the size of our wildlife management area on the Rensselaer Plateau, and it will create an entire new state forest on the Rensselaer Plateau by the time we're done. So that's a major coup for us at that point. And so that's a real good project. And again, that started back with a willing owner or willing seller, Tom's group jumping in, and we're just beginning to see some movement on that project. And that will be a number of stages. That one will take multiple years before we complete that. So in a nutshell, that was basically it, real quick and dirty, focusing on the major projects we have going on in the plateau. Back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Bill. So I guess, well, I've got to give me 1 second here to spotlight myself. I don't know if I can do that. Can everybody see me as a speaker?
No.
No. Bear with me 1 second. Zoom doesn't seem to want to let me do the same thing I was able to do for everybody else here. So I am going to start talking, even though you can't see my face, while I try to figure this out at the same time. I really wanted to focus tonight on the RPA's community forests and our community engagement. And so I'm not going to talk about everything, but I'll talk about that, and I'll do it. I'll tell a couple stories. I'm sorry, I'm really distracted, but okay, I think I got it. Now you should be able to see me. Okay, so for us, the stage was set back in 2011. Before that, we were actually already doing community engagement. We were working on a Rensselaer Plateau regional conservation plan and inviting the public in and our municipal officials. So we were already like poised for that, you know, working with the community and engaging with the community. In 2011, board member of ours, Walter Kirsch, and I drove out to a all-day workshop at the Harvard Forest in Petersham, Massachusetts. Walter went to a breakout session in the afternoon that was about community forests. And on the 2.5-hour drive home, that's all I heard about was community forests. Walter was really excited about this idea. And he came back and he presented it to the board, really animated, excited about it. We started learning, and in 2013, we actually hosted a conference at the Old Daily Inn on Crooked Lake, and we invited in other land trusts and towns, government officials, and folks from DEC, and we brought in experts from New England that knew about community forests, and we all learned about how to do it. The following year, we held a public workshop, and we invited the public in to form a committee. And this committee spent a year looking for a piece of land to create a community forest on. And they looked at a dozen different parcels and wound up with what is now the Posakill Community Forest. So that was a committee of community members already like involved in doing that. So our approach is really to invite the community in and empower them to make decisions. And we really want the people that are participating in these committees to feel the ownership. It's almost like having a little friends group for every property that we own. We have this for most properties. And they're making all kinds of decisions. They're doing their own pet projects. You know, for example, one committee member decided he wanted to restore the old apple orchard at the Albert family community forest. So he spent a couple of years working on that, and those apple trees are all in bloom this year and ready to produce apples. So, you know, over the years, the committees are making these decisions, and our board has never had to say no to anything that they've wanted to do. It's a really great model, and it brings a lot of energy in. And I'll just tell another quick story about the Barberville Falls Preserve. Troy is smiling because he knows about this project. But we took ownership of this in 2019. Other organizations and the town of Posakill turned it away. They didn't want it. Had a lot of problems. The property had been closed for over the summers between Memorial Day and Labor Day because of the visitors trespassing on the neighbor's land and parking where they shouldn't park and things like that. So we had we wrote a grant, and we had a plan to engage the community. COVID happened. We didn't get our grant. People were parked all over the road, and I heard from the neighbors every day during that. But what we did was we invited the neighbors in to our meetings. and we formed a committee of the neighbors and the community. And with that, we actually wound up dipping into our reserves because we didn't get the grant we were expecting. We built parking in a new spot, and we did this we listened to the neighbors and their concerns and their ideas, and we built this parking area, and volunteers built kiosks, and the Rensselaer Land Trust and Rensselaer Plateau Alliance joint trail crew jumped in and built this beautiful new trail down to the bottom of the falls. And this all happened with the involvement of the neighbors and the community. And I forgot to say, I meant to say early on, when one neighbor told us right off the bat, you don't know what you're getting into. Nothing's gonna make any difference here. And the last time I saw him, he said, yes, this is, people aren't walking through our land anymore, and it's pretty much, it's working. So we've done that with most of our properties. This is our lands we owned. I want to show you in 2014. This was our first community forest here, the post-kill community forest over here on the left-hand side. It's kind of lonely there out in the open all by itself. And here we are in 2021. And you can see the conserved lands from the Albert family community forest down in the south to up through some of the Coe lands here on Chestnut Hill, more Coe lands that are expanding the Capital District Wildlife Management Area. This is the new state forest that Bill was talking about. And our post-kill community forest is right here connected in with all these other properties. This is the Grafton forest up here. So this is this property up here labeled A is a new community forest that's coming in Grafton. It is it's already has a community formed, people are involved, and we're planning for it. We got a grant from the U.S. Forest Service. So look for that property coming next spring, probably, where it will close this fall, but hopefully have it opened up to the public in the spring. And we're excited to have a new community forest over in Petersburg. It's 150 acres, and that will bring in a new community of people, hopefully over there. We haven't formed a committee on that one yet, but we're in the works. These projects are all in contract. And that's it. I just, for us, the engaging the community and involving people has been very rewarding for us, and it gets a lot of folks involved. So if you want to get involved, you can go to our website, rensselaerplateau.org/volunteer, and contact Dan Morse or fill out the volunteer engagement form, or you can contact me at this email or phone number. And I will stop sharing now, and we can take your questions. And I'm going to stop spotlighting myself if I can, so you can see other people. If I can. I will ask a question first and let someone answer while I try to figure out how to make it so that you can see everybody else. So, Troy says 6 years, that's fast for New York State. And Karen Ross asks, if you can, please, oops, sorry. Well, sorry, Karen, I didn't realize that was not meant for the public. So we're looking for how the role individual families play in acquisition and planning of the community forest. So, yeah, so that's a good question. What's the role of individual families? At the Albert Family Community Forest, that was really inspired by the Poseyville Community Forest. And Kevin and Mary Albert had made a donation to that project for us, and I called him to say thank you, and he invited me to come and see his property, and we talked about all the different options that they could use to conserve the property. They own this property down in East Nassau, and didn't want to see it developed, but we're ready to move on. And so we talked about community forest, and they decided they wanted to do it. We got a grant that paid for half, and they donated half of that. And they've been involved. They stayed involved in that land. Mary stayed involved with the committee, and it took them a while to decide they wanted to put their name on it, but they really wanted to impress upon their children and grandchildren their sense of philanthropy. So that's how that came about. We have another family that was also inspired by that. They didn't have property, but they'd saved their money over the years, and they wanted us to go and look for a property that could be a community forest in their name. So we're working on that right now. That'll be the Valentino Family Community Forest in Grafton. But next question looks like it's also about community forests. How does RPA, whoops, nope. Are most community forests open all time to public or escorted only at visits with RPA staff? Our community forests, all of our properties at the moment are open 365 days a year from dawn to dusk. And, in the evenings or overnight with permission ahead of time for special events. Next question is, how does RPA plan to deal with the risks of people getting hurt at the falls and littering the area? Oh, sorry. Yep. The questions are coming in, and I'm reading them as they're scrolling by, so forgive me if I'm missing. Yeah, so we have liability insurance, and people don't seem to be littering too much there. We have volunteers and people that pick up more than is dropped. What I've seen mostly there is a couple scraps that probably fell out of someone's car when they opened the door, and they didn't even know they dropped it. But we've had a couple of incidents, so that's it. If people get hurt, we have insurance in the New York General Obligations Law to protect us from the liability there. And we're posted signs so that people hopefully don't do what the very risky things like climbing on the falls. Kara asks, does each organization have a vision for an amount conserved in the future? A 5-year plan or 25 years?
I'll chime in on that one. So I mentioned that we are losing forest land at an alarming rate in the country, and it's estimated to be between 30 and 50 million acres that are going to be lost, and that's a lot of land. So the Conservation Fund has set a goal of 5 million acres over 10 years. We're about 2 years into that, so we got a little ways to go to get to that goal. But our work is really entirely driven by the desire of partners such as the state of New York here or RPA to take on these projects. So we can encourage and we can find the tools and hopefully working together, as Bill says, we can all accomplish these kinds of things. So we're really trying to make a dent in that forest land loss. That's why we're developing these sophisticated financing tools to get there.
Next up.
I can chime in too. So for ASA, we have land conservation plans to help sort of prioritize. And so we had a 5-year plan that just ended in 2020, which we tried to get to 24,000 acres total, which we did. So we're just embarking on creating a new 5-year land conservation plan. So we don't really have a number in mind, but down the road, kind of in general, we've been talking about a total of 65,000 acres. Sounds about right to sort of stabilize, particularly the ag land base that we need in the two counties that we service. It's kind of back of the envelope, but.
In Columbia County, we've been looking at the 30 by 30 plan. So the president's plan to protect 30% of the land by 2030. Right now, in Columbia County, 19% of our farmland is protected. So we're looking to have 30% protection of our farmland, and then similarly looking to have, so that it's distributed throughout the county, 30% land protected within each county. We do have a couple of towns that are at 30%. We also have some towns that are hovering around 7%. So that will help us focus in which areas around the county we should be looking at doing some of our conservation work. And then there's also a mid-Hudson forest corridor that helps connect all the way from the Southern Appalachians up through the Greens and then up to Tom's Neck in the woods in Maine. And this mid-Hudson corridor is a pinch point in that connection area. So ensuring that we're able to have a place where species can migrate northward through that mid-Hudson forest corridor that extends into Rensselaer County as well is a key priority.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Jim. I just wanted to say for DEC, our planning is a little different. We're certainly based off the open space plan, which was first written in 1992, was the first edition of that, and that gets periodically updated. That's actually a public process with a bunch of regional committees that get together that have partners, have interested landowners, other interested parties that work on these committees, and then identify the areas they want to see conserved. And then the regional committees put together the local input, and then that goes into a statewide document, and that's in partnership with the Office of Parks as well. So that's the DEC's process in a nutshell, and that gets updated periodically. And the last time it was updated was 2016, so it is due for one. And like I said, it would be a public process, so everyone would be notified when that is active.
And yes, we also set goals for ourselves in our strategic plan. And in our 2014 strategic plan, we gave ourselves a goal of 18,000 acres by 2018 or something. We made it to 13,000, but the ambitious goal for us was, just because I don't feel bad because we didn't make it. It was a goal to shoot for, and that's kind of we revised our next strategic plan and have another number of thousands of acres in there by 2024. So we've got about 800 acres in the works just this year, and more in the queue after that. So let's see. Next question. For community forest funds, someone said they need to be designated as a forest legacy area. Are there more areas ripe for designation in that area but aren't? So I guess that's what he's asking is, so I can answer that the forest legacy area only pertains to the forest legacy program. Is that right, Bill? So it's only forest legacy grants that that are restricted to forest legacy areas. The other grants like the forest program is not restricted, and the work that Tom is doing is not restricted to forest legacy areas. That's only a designation that opens up the opportunity for those funds from that program.
Yeah, that's all forest legacy is a funding source.
And another question for Troy or Tom, any idea the magnitude or range of what a landowner might expect to be compensated annually? Pick a kind of typical deal in AFF or Silvaterra's programs. So carbon sequestration.
Troy's the expert on that.
So AFF is still pretty new in regards to where they're going to be selling their carbon for. Generally on the carbon markets, what I look for is somewhere around $150 an acre per year. Actually, no, I'm sorry, that's over the 10 years. So it's going to be $15 to $20 an acre per year, multiplied by the number of years of the contract.
Any other questions? I see people saying thank you. Any of you folks have any closing comments?
I would just like to say that the work of your local land trusts, in this case, Rensselaer Plateau Alliance and ASA and Columbia Land Conservancy, is really the greatest work. And if you live in their service areas, you care about what they're doing, please consider joining them, following their activities, participating, volunteering, leaving them in your will. This is what really will help conserve your communities.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you all
for Troy. Who do you contact for that carbon credit?
So Sylvia Terra is the one that I'd be recommending. I can send you a link for that. I'll put my email real quick in the chat, and you can contact me outside the meeting. So don't close just yet, Jim. Let me get this in there. It's troy.weldy@clctrust.org. So.
All right, I will leave that up for, I won't close the Zoom out just yet. So people can have a minute to copy that if they want.
And anybody that does decide to explore that, let me know, let Jim know. We kind of want to know what the experience is of folks that are utilizing this. Like I said, I do feel it's a low risk program, given that Sylvia Terra is just 1-year contracts. The American Forest Foundation, those are probably going to be 20-year contracts.
All right. Thanks, Troy. Thank you, everybody.